Welcome to week 4 of Mpai 600 here at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies Applied Intelligence Program. Just want to start off with a couple of announcements. So September 26th, just some upcoming dates, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, you will have a Zoom session. Groups 1, 2, and 3 will brief about 20 to 25 minutes for the brief. It'll be about 5 to 10 minutes for questions, so 30 minutes total for each group. I'm expecting, again, PowerPoint slides based on the guidance for paper 2. And just as a reminder, again, you should start kind of coalescing as groups, or you should already have been doing that so far. And as we start going through the next material, start thinking about how you want to present this data. So that's for the presentations, and then the papers due for groups 4, 5, and 6 that 3 days later on that Sunday night. So just be advised of those upcoming days going forward. Again, we got some assignments or deliverables coming up that are outside the normal discussion sections. And again, I just mentioned, start thinking about your paper. So go to the paper guidance now, and as you're going through, particularly last week or this past week, and then this upcoming week, start thinking about how you want to craft your paper based on the material as well as the answer for the paper. So just to review paper 1, again, I graded about 90% of them already. Most of you did fine, and I think as I teach this class, maybe I'm getting a better cohort of students. Maybe I'm explaining the paper guidance better. But I think pretty much everyone did a pretty good job overall. I mentioned some issues with some papers, and they were pretty common issues. So if I put some comments down on your paper, don't take it personally. You probably had a lot of the same things that other students had. And the biggest one was requirements are way too broad. And this is, most of you had requirements that are way too broad. Is there going to be a terrorism threat in my city? That's meaningless. That is a meaningless requirement. It's just saying, is there bad stuff going on out there? Something like, does ISIS use Telegram to attract men 18 to 25 years old in East Nashville? That is something you can collect on. And the whole point is that you've done your homework to a point that you have an idea that ISIS uses Telegram, and Telegram's a social media app that's not really used in the United States, but it's used worldwide. You know that ISIS uses that. You know they're using that to recruit certain Muslim populations. You know there's a high Muslim population in East Nashville, and you know that they tend to focus on that age group. Okay, that's enough. Let's go collect. Questions about where are people going to infiltrate across the border mean nothing to actual intelligence requirements and intelligence collection stuff. Focus. When you think you've focused enough, focus it even more. So that's kind of an example. And again, we had examples, everything from counterterrorism to China in the South China Sea to actions of the Houthis in Yemen, which a very prescient person who wrote that based on what happened this past weekend in Saudi Arabia. So again, narrow the requirements. Policy versus intel requirements. Try and start off with a threat look from your perspective. Don't say, let me evaluate how my cybersecurity policy is in my business unit. Say, does the adversary want to use spear phishing to gain vital inside information in my business unit? Start from the adversarial perspective, not evaluating your own policy. Because if you're going to evaluate your own policy, I guarantee you're going to bring your own biases into it. In the real world, someone has probably invested a lot into whatever that cyber policy is, or that policy for international security, and it might be your boss, and you're going to probably craft the intelligence to please his policy outcome. It's not what you want to do. You want to look at it from an adversarial perspective. And then social media exploitation. It's good. A lot of people brought up OSINT, social media exploitation, as a potential avenue. The problem with that is, again, not all problem sets lend themselves to social media exploitation. Good ones that do Russian involvement in the Ukraine, the Donbass region in Ukraine, social media can exploit pretty well. ISIS recruiting or right-wing extremist recruiting of young men, that can be open source information can be used in that perspective. Social media exploitation is not good is MS-13. MS-13 uses real in-person recruiting, familial recruiting, not necessarily social media exploitation. North Korea obviously is not a very good target for that. So a lot of people brought that up. Just be cognizant of that. So week 3 review. A lot covered week 2, two case studies, the Pearl Harbor and the Yom Kippur. And as we're going through the case studies, I think looking at the schools of where intelligence failure comes from is important. There's the traditional school, which again calls for the basic connect the dots. There's too much information, that the analysts had too much information coming in and they couldn't decide what was the most important. We're going to talk about that for Pearl Harbor. We did talk about that. We're going to talk about that in 9/11. You have the reformist school, and this is the boxes. You'll see this in the 9/11, that the right people, the intelligence failure occurred because the boxes were in different scenarios. The right people didn't report to the right people, which would have allowed for proper decision. This is also, a key point in the Pearl Harbor case study when information was flown to the federal government or collected at the federal level, but it wasn't disseminated to the commanders on the ground because of bureaucratic rules and other issues. You're going to see the 9/11 case study where information was collected at the federal level, the National Security Agency, but it wasn't disseminated down to the San Diego Police Department, which could have stopped 9/11, or the investigators down in San Diego, for, again, bureaucratic reasons. This is the reformist school. This is why intelligence failures occur, because, again, it's not information, but the information is not going to the right places. And then the contrarian school is the collection assets. There's just not enough collection assets out there, or the collection was misused, and that's why intelligence failures occur. It's not the analysis, it's not the policymakers, it's at the front end that there's not enough collection assets, or the collection assets are being misused. And then the Dahl has, I think, a little bit more of a thesis where he talks about tactical intelligence, and he argues that, I think correctly, that a lot of the failure occurs at the interface between analysts and policymakers, and that is, and the reason why policymakers aren't receptive to intelligence is because it's not tactically oriented. You can say there's a threat out there somewhere. This was we talked about a second, but in order for a policymaker to be receptive or a military leader to be receptive, he has to say, hey, give me enough of the tactical information, the time, place, location, where I can make actual decisions. And that is essentially his thesis, is that you have to make the intelligence so close that it has to be receptive, or that allows it to be receptive and actioned on. I don't necessarily agree with this. The reason being is rarely is intelligence that specific. In the 9/11 case study, there is no intelligence out there that's going to say that here's the 19 people that are coming into our country. Here are the 4 planes that are going to be hijacked. Here is the time that they're going to be hijacked. This is the target that's going to be hijacked. This is when they're going to get on board. No, that doesn't work in the real world. For those of you who've been to Iraq and Afghanistan, there's no intelligence out there, or rarely will you ever get intelligence that says the IED is going to be planted at 9 o'clock at this intersection by this people at this general time. That doesn't exist. So that brings me to the Sharma School, TM. This isn't really Sharma School. I'm just calling it that. But this is essentially dovetails off the Dahl thesis and says you, as an intel analyst, have to provide enough information so that commanders can mitigate risk. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take the IED scenario. So you're not going to know the time, place, and location of every IED that gets in place, but you can, through your analysis and your intelligence, determine a pattern where you see IEDs most likely to occur, and you can allow the commander to make decisions that reduce risk. If you know an IED is going to be coming in at 9 o'clock in the morning, you can make sure that the first patrol that goes off the convoy, off the forward operating base, is not just a big logistics patrol, but maybe a dismounted patrol, people who are actually walking. In the Pearl Harbor example, I think that the intelligence could have given enough information that, yeah, you didn't know attack was going to occur December 7th at 8 o'clock in the morning, but you could have put reasonable mitigation measures, longer patrols, canceling Sunday leave, better use of radar that could have stopped the Pearl Harbor attack. And again, it's not really the Sharma School, but the statute is what are reasonable countermeasures that could have been in place to stop a massive disaster. When you're talking about 9/11, think about that going forward. Were there reasonable countermeasures? An unreasonable one would have been, stopping all flights for an unknown period of time. That's not reasonable. But reasonable ones would have been, hey, based on the information, based on the history, based on the intelligence, we think that a plane could be used in a hijacking form, and we recommend reinforcing the cockpit door, or we recommend putting the drink cart in front of all cockpit doors. That is a reasonable countermeasure to an intelligence problem, and just think about that going forward. And then the Yom Kippur War, again, just some of the intelligence failures, over-reliance on just one single human source. You saw that in the Al Jazeera video. Addiction to preconceived notions. The concept, which was brought up in the Radal article about the Egyptians would only attack if they could undermine or destroy the Israeli Air Force. Egyptians didn't need to do that to successfully pull off their attack. And then lack of an intelligence assessment. Again, a lot of the Israelis focused on planes to planes, tanks to tanks. They didn't focus on plane to surface to air missile, tank to anti-tank missile. That's types of asymmetries in their intelligence assessment, which led them to disaster in the first days of the Yom Kippur War. So week 4 preview. I just want to say right off the top of the head, this is a lot of work this week. Be prepared for that. A lot of documentaries to watch, lots of reading to do. So 2 case studies, Iraq WMD and 9/11. As I get older, these tend to be history, but they certainly weren't history for me. I lived them very intimately. So Iraq WMD, you have the Rachel Maddow documentary. Again, it's kind of a, the source is definitely a political source here, but I just ask that you kind of filter that out and look at the data that it's provided in the documentary. The 60 Minutes, the curveball, which I think is a excellent piece of an intelligence failure. And then the commission, Iraq WMD commission report. The commission report's 200 pages long. Do not read 200 pages. It's categorized around to blue boxes, really centered around these blue boxes that you'll see in the paper. And so read the blue boxes, and by reading those, you'll have an understanding of the Iraq WMD failure. And if there's something that piques your interest, you can read a little bit more in depth there. But again, don't read the whole thing. Make sure you just hit the high points from the blue boxes from the reading, and then just take it from there. And then you have my lectures. And then 9/11, you have the documentaries, the National Geographic documentary, the NOVA NSA documentary. You have the readings, the DAL, and then the 9/11 Commission, and then you have my lectures. So a lot this coming week, but it will feed into the paper that you have that's due the following week. So focus as much as you can going forward.